Now, I want to put on the table for our discussion some examples that might look paradoxical. And I'm thinking here of a couple of examples he gives in the last chapter of the book, where he starts talking about actually applying the harm principle in practice. And he gives a couple of examples. One is that he says, whoever succeeds in an overcrowded profession or in a competitive examination, whoever is preferred to another in any contest for an object which both desire, reaps benefit from the loss of others, from their wasted exertion and their disappointment. But it is by common admission better for the general interest of mankind that persons should pursue their objects undeterred by this sort of consequences. So he's saying, if you have competitive exams for positions in the civil service or something like that, it's great for the person who wins, but what about the person who loses? The person who loses is harmed, isn't he? Or isn't she?
I think they're certainly losing out.
They're losing out, yeah.
But
then,
go ahead.
What
No.
would you say?
but then maybe something better is awaiting this person.
Maybe. I think what Mill has in mind is we could say, well, rather than give out the jobs in the civil service on a meritocratic basis, we could give everybody a turn to have them. Or we could give them out on the basis of gender or race. There are many ways to give them out. And then he wants to say, by common admission, it is better for the general interests of mankind. Here's another example he gives. He says, it was once thought to be the duty of governments in all cases which were considered to be important to fix prices and regulate the process of manufacture. But it is now recognized, though not until after a long struggle, that both the cheapness and the quality of commodities are better delivered if we have no government fixing of prices, the so-called doctrine of free trade. So he's saying, of course, free trade harms some people. We have free trade, we won't have big government subsidies for farmers. It harms the farmers, right? But it's now generally recognized that it's better to have free trade. Okay, you can see why he would say that. But the reason I'm bringing these examples up is it seems to be a contradiction, isn't it? I mean, after all, if you go back to the harm principle where we started, he says the object of this essay is to assert a very simple principle as entitled to govern people's dealings with one another. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted in interfering with one another is self-protection. But notice this phrase in the middle. He says, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. So can you see why I'm starting to wonder about this? On the one hand, he's saying, well, it's now generally accepted that competitive examinations in the civil service are better. It's now generally accepted that free trade is better. But I thought we weren't allowed to go by what's generally accepted, right? So doesn't it seem like there's a contradiction here? He's, after all, appealing to what opponents of free trade would call the moral coercion of public opinion. Yeah? So we know Mill wasn't stupid. How do you think he might reconcile this? It's like a pretty glaring contradiction, no?
Oh, yeah. There are certain parts of his rhetoric where there's a lot of emphasis on it, and there's certain different parts of his rhetoric where there aren't. And I'm sure he's got to find a way to navigate between those two.
Okay, he does. And it's not easy to see it until it's spelled out. So let me just spell it out. His way out involves a two-step inquiry. So for any proposed action, the first question is, does it harm some third party? Does it harm somebody else? If the answer is no, then it's protected by the harm principle, right? So whether it's drinking alcohol or freedom of speech. There's no harm to anybody from any of these things. If the answer is yes, then Mill doesn't say we should bar the action, right? Then he says, do the utilitarian thing. In other words, what Mill would say if he were sitting here, I think, about these two examples that we've been discussing, he'd say any system of giving out a scarce resource harms somebody, like a job. Any system. If we give it out on the basis of race, it harms the people who are of the disfavored race. If we give it out on the basis of merit, it harms the people who are not smart. If we give it out on the basis of
Preferential treatment, maybe.
preferential treatment, it's going to be, you're going to ask a question.
Yeah. We came back to it. If in the case of something like a job, a scarce resource, if it's given to somebody and not somebody else,
Yeah.
is the person that it's not given to really harmed, or are they just left alone? And if the case is that they're just left alone, can you harm somebody by doing nothing?
Okay, so that is a very good question that we're going to deal with next time, and that is a question of whether externalities, what economists call externalities of an action, count as harms, right? So, for instance, if a physician operating on you leaves the scissors in your stomach, he wasn't trying to leave the scissors in your stomach, he made a mistake, right? He was trying to remove the tumor, right? So that would be an externality of his action. So what externality should be counted is a very tricky subject, and we'll dig into that next time.
Just
yeah.
one question. Does this mean then that we should only look at the intention of harm?
Whether it's intentional is a good question as well. And indeed, we'll see that certain kinds of harms to count as harms have to be intentional, and others do not. We're also going to talk about that next time, so I'm going to just push it off to one side. But it's a very good question to ask. But the short answer to your question right now is Mill is not getting to the externalities point. He says with giving away the jobs, I'm conceding that it harms somebody. And he's just saying the point I, John Stuart Mill, want to make is that any way of giving out jobs harms somebody. Okay. Therefore, you can't call it self-regarding. Therefore, we have to do the best utilitarian thing, and that is, we now think, giving them out meritocratically is the best way to do it. So once the harm principle is triggered, because we're not in the realm of self-regarding action, then we do the utilitarian thing, informed by science, public policy, studies, and so on, always, of course, helped along by freedom of speech, which criticizes received opinion, and so on. Okay, and it's exactly the way he would talk about the free trade issue as well. He'd say, of course, free trade harms some people, but any trade regime is going to harm some people, because any trade regime also is about how scarce benefits get distributed in the society. And because any trade regime harms somebody, it's not in the realm of self-regarding action. We do the utilitarian thing. Okay, so it's a two-step inquiry. As I said, if there's no harm, it's self-regarding, the harm principle applies. If there is harm, inevitably going to be harm, it's other regarding, and then you do the utilitarian thing. So that's the way in which he tries to put it all together. Which is not to say that it's without problems, and we're going to talk about some of the problems next time. And in preparation for that, I want you to think about these two questions. The first actually is implicit in the questions you just brought up about externalities and about the issue of intentionality, you'll see. But so the first is, in what respects, if any, you've now already started to indicate there are some respects in what respects is the harm principle ambiguous? And try and crystallize those in your mind before we pick things up next time. And the second question I want to ask you is there a sense in which the harm principle is inherently conservative? And for that, I want you to start in your own mind trying to make the link between what we've been discussing today and what might seem to be something a long way away, namely the Pareto principle. Because it turns out that there's an important underlying architectural symmetry between Mill's harm principle and the Pareto principle. And we'll get into that next time.